It wasn't just the roast that cooked slowly, it was murder. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host Harrington. Let's grow this clever crew. Drop your location in the comments. I love seeing where you're all from. Story time begins now. You can say a lot of things about Nero Wolfe, and I've said most of them, some to his face and the rest in the privacy of my inner monologue. But what you cannot say is that the man is easily moved. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, or the complete collapse of Western civilization would have to knock twice before getting past the vestibule. Which is why, when I saw him lower the New York Times a full inch at the whiff of nutmeg from the kitchen, I took note. It was Friday. The air was brisk, the radiator was clanking like a jazz trio with a hangover, and I was 3/4 through typing up notes from a previous case that Wolfe deemed a sufficiently nourishing intellectual exercise to offset its utter lack of aesthetic. I was about to tell him he could use shorter sentences when the doorbell rang. Fritz was busy prepping some obscure Austrian dish that involved veal, bay leaves, and, yes, nutmeg. So I did my duty and answered the door. She was 5'5", with dark hair pinned up like it had somewhere important to be, and didn't care how it got there. Her coat was belted tight like it was holding in more than just curves, and her smile had a cracked edge like it had been worn recently under duress. "Mr. Wolfe?" she asked, scanning the hall behind me like maybe she expected to see a parade. "He's vertical, only under extreme circumstances," I told her. "But he listens from a chair as well as any man standing. Come in." She hesitated for half a beat, just long enough for me to tag her as nervous but not scared. There's a difference. Nervous meant she wanted something. Scared meant she had something to hide. Either way, I gestured her inside, took her coat, and showed her into the office. Wolfe didn't rise, of course not, but he did glance up from his chair, eyebrows arching slightly, as if her presence had interrupted a particularly thrilling paragraph about Bulgarian plums. "This is Mr. Nero Wolfe," I said. "And you are?" "Clara Vole," she said. "I'm the pastry chef at Lamb & Baxter." Wolfe grunted. That meant nothing to him, but the name rang a bell for me. Lamb & Baxter was one of those upscale bakeries that had lines out the door, and cappuccinos that cost more than rent in the Bronx. "You'll pardon me," Wolfe said, "if I ask you to proceed to the substance. I am not a patron of your establishment." Clara folded her hands. She had slim fingers, calloused at the tips, a working baker, not one of those Instagram darlings who decorate cupcakes with tweezers. "It's not about a cake," she said. "It's about a recipe, a specific one. One that never should have been shared, but somehow was. And now someone's going to get hurt, professionally, maybe worse." Wolfe looked pained, the way he does when someone brings up public transit or musical theatre. "You are aware," he said, "that I do not undertake cases of industrial espionage or commercial sabotage. They are tedious." "It's not sabotage," she said. "It's theft of something personal, and the man who stole it, he's in your circle." That got his attention. Wolfe didn't react visibly, but I've watched that man do mental calculus like a chess master with a god complex. "In my circle," he repeated. "Be precise." Clara's mouth twitched. "He was here, in this house, 2 days ago. I saw his name in the appointment book. And now, yesterday, my signature recipe, the one I created for a special client event, showed up on the arrivals menu, down to the dusting of nutmeg on the custard top." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "This is what's been done with it. You'll notice the description. It's nearly verbatim from my file. I took it from her. It was a menu clipping from a place called Bakering Heights. I'd been there once on a date I wanted to forget. The dessert listing matched her tone. Elegant, exact, and just short of arrogant. "This sounds like a civil dispute," Wolfe said. "So you should consult an attorney. I don't want to sue him. I want to know how he got it and why. Someone gave it to him or sold it. I need to know who." Wolfe leaned back slightly. His eyes closed, just for a second. Then he opened them and fixed her with a gaze that could reduce butter to liquid. "You're asking me to investigate the pilfering of a dessert. You must understand how that sounds." "It wasn't just a dessert," she snapped. "It was my life's work in a ramekin, and whoever took it did it here, in this house, and you let him in." That landed. Wolfe sat forward, not much, just enough to qualify as motion. "Archie," he said without turning, "get the log from Wednesday afternoon. I wish to see who violated my roof in the name of pastry." When Nero Wolfe asks for the log, it isn't some dusty ledger with fountain pen, ink and wine stains. It's a tidy little binder I update daily, which includes every name, timestamp, and declared reason for entry. Wolfe doesn't like unpredictability inside his walls, unless it's marinated, sautéed, or decanted. I retrieved the log from my desk drawer and brought it over. Wolfe motioned toward the globe stand beside him, the one we keep for purely aesthetic purposes and the occasional dramatic spin. I set the log on top. He flipped it open with the tip of one finger like it might bite. "There," I said, pointing. "Wednesday, 3:15. Russell Darnell, cookbook consultation. Stayed about 25 minutes. Coffee, no cream." Clara's posture stiffened like she'd been hit with a cold draft. "Darnell," she said. "Of course." "You know him?" I asked. She let out a short laugh with no humor in it. "He used to be my mentor. Then he became my competitor. Now he's apparently my thief." Wolfe exhaled through his nose, which for him is about as expressive as slamming a fist on the table. "I recall Mr. Darnell," he said. "He came seeking verification of a translation from Le Livre des Menus. He brought madeleines." "He brought theft," Clara muttered. "That recipe on the menu, I wrote it for a private client event. It was in my folder. My folder was in Darnell's apartment until last month when I took it back. He must have made a copy, but I never told him the final version." "Then how would he reproduce it exactly?" Wolfe asked. Clara hesitated. "There's only one way. The printout was in my satchel when I came here Tuesday to drop off some eclairs for a tasting with Fritz. He invited me in, and I left the satchel in the hall while we chatted in the kitchen. I knew where this was going. Wolfe did too." "You're suggesting," I said, "that someone in this house lifted the recipe from your bag." "I'm suggesting it was here that he got it, and the only people here were Mr. Wolfe, Fritz, and whoever else had access that day." She didn't say my name, but she didn't need to. Wolfe's nostrils flared just slightly. Outrage by his standards. "You accuse me of harboring a pickpocket?" "No," Clara said quickly. "I'm saying someone used your trust or your hospitality." Which to Wolfe was the same thing. I stepped in. "Look, Miss Vole, there's a chance this is a coincidence. Recipes aren't intellectual property. People copy, adapt, share. It doesn't mean someone stole yours out of your bag." "No," she said, shaking her head. "This isn't similar, it's exact. The nutmeg is the giveaway. Most people use cinnamon in that base. This recipe used nutmeg, ginger, and a drop of blood orange extract. It's my signature, and someone took it." Wolfe closed the binder, eyes settling into that half-lidded predatory calm he gets when someone's handed him a puzzle with a corner piece already snapped in. "Archie," he said, "call Mr. Darnell. Inform him I have a culinary matter to discuss. Invite him for lunch." Clara opened her mouth, probably to object, but Wolfe cut her off with a single raised finger. "No accusations." "Not yet. We inquire, then we confront." I gave her a look that said, "Trust me. He knows what he's doing," and she gave me one that said, "He better." She left with a promise to remain available and a warning that if her work showed up anywhere else, someone was going to need more than coffee to stay awake at night. Once she was gone, Wolfe finally spoke, almost to himself. "An intrusion," he said. Not of flesh, but of taste. Culinary betrayal, I said. High crimes and custard. He looked at me with mild disgust. You are, as always, glib, but this is not trite. She is correct. The theft, if it occurred here, is intolerable. He paused, then added, No. Man shall commit larceny in my house and go unexposed. I knew then it wasn't about nutmeg anymore. If you want to see Nero Wolfe interested in something besides food, orchids, or convincing the world to leave him alone, then show him a violation of his private order. And nothing says violation like the possibility that someone passed through the brownstone's doors, drank his coffee, and left with something they shouldn't have touched. Wolfe had said culinary matter when instructing me to call Russell Darnell, and that wasn't just his usual flair for euphemism, it was tactical. You don't summon a suspect, even a maybe suspect, by shouting thief through the telephone. You tempt them in with comfort, you serve lunch, you pretend nothing's burning. Darnell agreed to come over at 1 the next day, which gave me just enough time to start a list. Because if Wolfe believed Clara Vole's story, and judging by the way he rubbed his temple with his left thumb and index finger that evening, he did, then we were looking at one of 3 possibilities. 1. Darnell really had stolen the recipe from her bag during his visit. 2. Someone else in the house had done it. 3. Clara was lying through her teeth. That last one was unlikely. I've seen liars. They fidget, they hedge, they lean too hard on the drama. Clara had been emotional but not showy. Her anger was sharp-edged and clean, like a blade that's been sharpened too many times to be dull anymore. So that left us with suspects. A neat little circle, 4 people counting Darnell. Russell Darnell, mid-40s, formerly a darling of the French pastry revival crowd, known for soufflés that didn't fall and a temper that did. He'd taught Clara at one point, then started his own shop 3 blocks from Lamb and Baxter, after she got promoted over him. His visit to the brownstone had been polite, brief, and, according to Wolfe, overly complimentary about Fritz's cannelés. A man who knew the difference between flattery and manipulation. Wolfe doesn't like either. Fritz Brenner, our in-house culinary genius, loyal, precise, and the only man Wolfe trusts near a saucepan. Fritz is Swiss by birth, devoted by temperament, and about as likely to steal a recipe as Wolfe is to attend a rock concert. Still, he had been alone with Clara in the kitchen. Opportunity, if not motive. Theodore Horstman, Wolfe's orchid man. Spends most of his waking life in the rooftop greenhouse, fussing over phalaenopsis and telling the heat pump when it's being unreasonable. He hadn't been downstairs during either Clara's or Darnell's visits, at least not to our knowledge. But the greenhouse opens to the second-floor hallway. You don't need to go far to notice a stray satchel. Me, Archie. Goodwin. Always the easiest suspect since I've got keys to everything and no poker face to speak of. Wolfe wouldn't accuse me unless he'd developed a sudden taste for absurdity. But the fact remained that I'd been in and out of the hall where Clara's satchel had been, which meant if someone was framing me, they had timing. Wolfe sat in, silence for most of the evening, staring not at his book but through it, his version of pacing. He didn't like what this implied, not that he had something to hide, but that someone else in the house might have something to gain. He doesn't do well with violations of trust. He once fired a temp secretary for misusing a paperclip, and now possibly one of his visitors had clipped something far more valuable. The next day, Darnell showed up on time, with a cravat that looked like it had been tied by a designer and a cologne that I could smell from the foyer. The man exuded confidence, like a bakery pumps out sugar steam, thick, sweet, and calculated. "Mr. Wolfe," he said with a broad smile as I brought him into the office, "a pleasure as always." Wolfe didn't rise, he never does, but he inclined his head half an inch, which in Wolfen terms is practically a hug. "You wish to discuss culinary authenticity," Wolfe said. A subject that demands precision. Please sit. Darnell took the red chair, the one closest to the globe, and crossed his legs like he was about to be interviewed for a glossy magazine. Always happy to talk about the craft. Something specific troubling you? I watched his eyes, not a flicker. If the man was worried, he'd iced it over with charm. Wolfe gestured toward the silver tray Fritz had brought in. Slices of tart. Fino pommes with a modest dollop of creme fraiche. Darnell accepted his plate like a man receiving a blessing. I was recently presented, Wolfe said, with an amuse-bouche bearing remarkable similarity to a composition debuted yesterday. At Bakering Heights. A custard tartlet. Nutmeg, ginger, a trace of citrus. You recognize the item? Darnell didn't even blink. Of course I invented it. Or rather, reimagined. I've been playing with warm spice profiles to offset dairy for months. Wolfe steepled his fingers. You presented no such flavor during your last visit. It wasn't ready. Timing is everything in patisserie. And in theft, I suppose. He smiled. Not that anyone would dare steal from me. I caught that. Not steal from, but steal from me. It was defensive, a shade of paranoia. He knew why we'd called him. Where'd you first test the recipe? I asked. In your shop. In my apartment, he said smoothly. I work things out privately before I ever touch commercial equipment. Ask anyone. Funny, I said. Clara Vole claims it was hers. Said it showed up on your menu after she left a printout in a bag. In this house. That got a reaction, not a big one. Just a hitch in the jaw. A slight tension in the way he set down his plate. Clara's mistaken, he said. She's passionate. She believes anything she touches is hers. But inspiration isn't ownership, and we've traded ideas before. Often. Maybe too often. You're saying she gave you the recipe? I asked. I'm saying we discussed the concept. Weeks ago. Maybe she built it from something I said, maybe the reverse, but the end result is mine. Wolfe cleared his throat. Discussion does not confer creation. Darnell stood, not aggressively, just with the quiet air of a man who thinks he's been insulted in someone else's house. I don't intend to argue legacy with you, Mr. Wolfe. If Miss Vole believes she's been wronged, she can take it to court. I have customers and a rising lunch service. Wolfe waved him off with a mild, indeed. After he left, Wolfe said nothing for a long while. I waited. Finally, he asked, Did you note the lack of surprise? I did. He expected confrontation, but not accusation. You think he's hiding something? Wolfe grimaced. I think he is not a man easily startled, which means either he is innocent or well prepared. I nodded. So what now? Now you go out. Speak to Miss Vole's colleagues. And Mr. Darnell's. Discover who knew of the recipe and when, and see if anyone else has tasted it before it appeared in print. And the angle? Wolfe's eyes gleamed. Flavor memory. Few can describe a custard. Fewer can forget one. When Nero Wolfe says go out, he doesn't mean I should take a casual stroll and soak up the ambience. He means dig, prod, pry, and stay out until I know something useful, preferably without being arrested, assaulted, or offering to buy anyone coffee that costs more than a tank of gas. Clara Vole had given us a list before she left, a neat, handwritten column of people she worked with at Lamb & Baxter. The core pastry team, plus one or two she thought might have known about the recipe or seen the draft. The recipe in question had been scribbled out in layers over months, one version in a binder, another in her head, and the final iteration on that fateful printout. Only she and the sous chef had supposedly seen the final version. She swore by that. So I started where any legman with a conscience and an appetite would, the bakery itself. Lamb & Baxter was one of those places where you walk in and start doubting your own palate. Everything looked like it had been glazed with science and baked with heartbreak. Little tartlets gleamed under glass like they were auditioning for a jewelry catalogue, and the smell, sweet butter, browned sugar, citrus peel, was enough to make your moral compass start drifting. I stepped up to the counter and showed my badge. Not a real one, of course. Just the little laminated square Wolfe had made up for me, identifying me as Mr. Wolfe's confidential assistant. It's a cross between a license and a threat, and it works better than a smile when dealing with defensive staff. A tall, tight-lipped man in a white apron approached, mid-30s, arms like sourdough logs. His name tag read, Simon. "You looking for a table or trouble?" he asked. "Trouble," I said. "Always pairs well with pastry." He didn't laugh. "We're busy." I handed him a card. "Archie Goodwin. I'm here on behalf of Nero Wolfe. You may have heard of him, thinks better sitting down than most people do running. I'd like to speak with anyone who worked with Clara Vole this past month." He eyed the card, then me. "What's this about?" "Let's just say a recipe turned up somewhere it shouldn't, and we're trying to find the leak. Unless you'd prefer the whole thing to go public with powdered sugar on top." That got me a meeting. He led me through a side door and into the staff lounge, small table, a fridge, bulletin board with passive-aggressive notes, and a lingering smell of espresso. He brought in two others, a woman named Mara who handled inventory and looked like she didn't sleep much, and the sous chef, Eric, a guy with wire-rimmed glasses and a nervous wrist twitch. "Clara's not in trouble, is she?" Mara asked. After I introduced myself again, "Not unless ambition's a crime," I said. "Did either of you see a printout of a new recipe she was working on? Custard tartlet with nutmeg and citrus?" Eric flinched. Not dramatically, but his left hand stopped tapping his knee. "I saw a draft," he said. "Couple weeks ago she asked for feedback on the custard texture, but that didn't include nutmeg, at least not then." "You're sure?" He nodded. "She was still using lemon zest, not blood orange. I'd remember the switch. It threw the whole profile toward winter," Mara added. "She was really protective. Of that final version. Said it was for someone important, didn't say who, wouldn't let anyone near her satchel. That checked out. Clara had said the final printout never left her bag, except for that one visit to Wolfe's kitchen." I made a note. I leaned back. "What do you all think of Russell Darnell?" Simon grimaced. "Overrated." "Arrogant," said Mara. Eric shrugged. "Used to be a genius. Now he's mostly a brand." "Did he ever visit Clara here?" Simon scoffed. "Not if we could help it. He once sent his assistant to try and poach her. That got ugly." "Assistant?" "Guy named Fletcher. Skinny, wore scarves in July." "Interesting." Clara hadn't mentioned him. I wrapped up the interview, thanked them for their time, and left with two key facts. No one admitted to seeing the final version of the recipe, and if Darnell had gotten it, it wasn't through these three. Which meant either someone was lying, or the theft had happened just as Clara suspected, when her satchel was left unattended inside the brownstone. I headed across town to Bakering Heights, Darnell's flagship bakery/showroom, where desserts got names like Whispers of Cardamom and Velvet Aftermath. I wanted to see how close his version was to hers, and who had tasted it before it hit the menu. The maitre d' was the kind of man who thought he was too good for you until you proved otherwise. I handed him my card, smiled like I belonged, and dropped Wolfe's name. That cracked the ice just enough to get me a quick conversation with the front-of-house manager, a polished brunette named Tanya, who looked like she'd walked off a Paris runway and into a double shift. "I'm trying to verify something," I said. "A custard tartlet, nutmeg, ginger, citrus. It debuted this week?" "Yes," she said. "It's already a hit. People are obsessed. One woman cried." "Anyone taste it before launch?" "Just the usual. Staff, two friends of Mr. Darnell, and a food writer, Francine Ross." I knew the name. Francine Ross didn't write puff pieces. If she'd tasted that tartlet before it launched, And if she'd written about it, there might be a timestamp trail. Can I get a copy of her tasting notes? She looked pained. Not without Darnell's permission. I gave her the kind of smile that suggested I wasn't going away. Tell you what, she said. She posted something on her blog. Might help. Bingo. I checked on my phone as soon as I stepped outside. Ross had published a preview piece 3 days ago. A glimpse of winter, Russell Darnell's latest triumph. And there it was in black and white. A warm custard nestled in pâte sucrée with a surprising depth from nutmeg, balanced by the ghost of blood orange. A masterstroke. Posted 3 days ago. Published the day after Clara visited Wolfe. I headed back to the brownstone thinking hard. The timeline was narrow, which meant the window of opportunity had been even narrower. Darnell had left Wolfe's house 30 minutes after Clara's visit. If he'd seen the recipe in that time, it hadn't been by coincidence. Inside, Wolfe was in the plant room with Theodore. I relayed what I'd found and dropped Francine Ross's post on the desk. He studied it for a moment, then closed his eyes. There. It is, he said. What? Confirmation. The flavor profile is exact. Too exact. No palate duplication by chance. I nodded. So, he had the recipe by Tuesday evening, meaning someone got it from Clara's bag, and fast. He opened his eyes. Archie summoned Fritz. Fritz came in from the kitchen, wiping his hands. Wolfe looked at him. Clara's bag. When she visited. Did you leave her alone? Fritz frowned. No, sir, except for a moment. I went down to the cellar for candied peel. She was looking at a copper mold. She said she'd wait in the kitchen. How long were you gone? 2 minutes. Wolfe looked at me. 2 minutes, he said softly. A lifetime under the right circumstances. I nodded. I'll run down Darnell's assistant, the scarf guy. Wolfe's gaze darkened. Do. And Archie. Be careful. Anyone who steals what they cannot. Create is capable of other trespasses. You'd be surprised how much damage can be done in 2 minutes. It doesn't take long to ruin a soufflé, break a heart, or lift a document from a satchel that's been carelessly tucked beside the radiator while its owner chats over copper molds and citrus glaze. What bothered me wasn't that someone had taken the recipe. It was how easily they'd done it. Wolfe's house was supposed to be a sanctuary, not a buffet for intellectual thieves. The next logical step was to find Russell Darnell's assistant, Fletcher, the scarf enthusiast, who may or may not have been lurking in places he shouldn't have been during Clara's visit. If Darnell hadn't seen the recipe with his own eyes, someone else had to get it into his hands. And if Fletcher had even sniffed the satchel, I wanted to know. Tracking him down turned out to be easier than expected. A quick call to Saul Panzer, Wolfe's go-to freelance sleuth, and the only man in New York who can tail someone without even casting a shadow, gave me an address. A one-bedroom walk-up in the East Village with a view of a brick wall and rent that would make you cry into your biscotti. Fletcher opened the door wearing a linen shirt open at the collar and a scarf that looked like it had been tie-dyed by a colorblind octopus. Fletcher? I asked. Yes? He blinked, nervous. Sharp jaw, pale skin, fingernails too clean. Who are you? Archie Goodwin. I'm investigating an issue involving your boss and a rather contested dessert. He didn't open the door any wider. I don't know anything about that. I leaned against the doorframe. I haven't even told you what the issue is yet. He froze. Rookie mistake. I mean, I don't look. Is this about Clara's recipe? Yes, I said. And now you've saved me 10 minutes of preamble. He tried to recover. Mr. Darnell told me the recipe was his, inspired by a conversation. That's not what I'm here to ask. I want to know where you were Tuesday between 3 and 4 in the afternoon. I was... He stopped again. At the cafe, meeting a supplier. I smiled. Which cafe? He hesitated. Little Birch, on 13th. Funny, I said. Saul Panzer saw you outside West 35th around that time, near Mr. Wolfe's residence. Fletcher blinked rapidly. Okay, yes, I was nearby. Russell asked me to drop something off, a book, for Wolfe. What book? He floundered. I pulled a bluff. Let me guess, it was Le Livre des Menus? Yes, he said, visibly relieved, which told me two things. One, he was lying. And two, he didn't know Wolfe already had a copy. I let him stew in it. You entered the house? No. I left the book on the step. That's all. You sure? Yes. I leaned in. Then how did Russell get Clara's recipe? Because the only time it could have been lifted was while she was in the kitchen and the bag was left alone. And if he didn't do it, someone else had to. I didn't touch her bag, Fletcher said quickly. Did you see it? He paused. Maybe. Describe it, he thought, then shook his head. I don't remember. He was sweating now. I left him with my card and a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. If you think of anything else, call me. If you don't, you'll be hearing from someone who won't smile at all. Back at the brownstone, I reported everything. Wolfe listened, steepling his fingers like he was building a cathedral out of clues. Fletcher lies badly, he said when I finished. Which makes him either a coward or a novice, or both. Yes, but cowards can be dangerous, particularly when led. I sat down. You think Darnell sent him to lift the recipe? I think Darnell is too vain to stoop. But he may have sent Fletcher with a general instruction. If you see anything useful, take it. Such latitude permits guilt without intention. Dangerous. Just then, Fritz entered the room with a look I'd only seen twice before. Once when he dropped a soufflé, and once when someone brought margarine into his kitchen. Mr. Wolfe, he said. Something is missing. Wolfe turned his head, slightly. Missing? Yes, sir. A tin of candied blood orange peel from the cellar. I keep it sealed and labeled. It's gone. When did you last see it? Tuesday, the same day Clara visited. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. You're certain? Yes. I used it that morning for a glaze. It's not something I leave lying around. Wolfe looked at me. Subtle trespass, he murmured. The theft of an ingredient. Small, seemingly inconsequential, yet symbolic. Someone took it to confirm or complete the recipe. It's not a common item, I added. You'd need it to recreate the tartlet precisely. Exactly. Darnell's version was not simply inspired, it was constructed. And now we know. With what? We sat in silence for a moment. The pieces were clicking into place. Someone had taken the recipe. Someone had taken the ingredient. The only question was, who orchestrated it, and why here? The doorbell rang. Fritz answered, and a moment later ushered in Saul Panzer. He looked his usual self. Calm, precise, trench coat folded over one arm like it was waiting for instructions. I've got something, he said, handing Wolfe a small envelope. Thought you'd want it sooner than later. Wolfe opened it, and removed a photograph. Grainy, but clear enough. It showed Fletcher, on the brownstone stoop, peering in through the vestibule window, time-stamped Tuesday, 3:42 p.m. Taken by a delivery man on the block, Saul said. Didn't know what he was snapping at the time. Just didn't like the look of the guy. Wolfe handed me the photo. That's right about when Fritz went to the cellar, I said, and Clara's bag was unattended. Wolfe nodded. He waited for opportunity. Darnell gave him incentive, and the moment presented itself. But we can't prove what he took. Not yet. I looked at Saul. Can you find out where Fletcher went after he left the brownstone? Already on it, he said. If he delivered something to Darnell or mailed it, we'll know. After Saul left, Wolfe leaned back and closed his eyes. I could almost see the machine ticking behind his forehead, gears of logic grinding through layers of deception. The theft is vulgar, he muttered. But what appalls me is the presumption. He opened his eyes. "Archie," he said, "we will have them all here tomorrow. The girl, the thief, the sycophant, and the egotist." "Everyone?" "Yes, and we will not shout. We will not accuse. We will bait." He paused, then added, "And when they spring the trap, we shall dine." If you've never seen Nero Wolfe in the act of applying pressure, don't expect shouting, door slamming, or histrionic finger-pointing. That's amateur hour. Wolfe prefers a different kind of talk, quiet, unrelenting, and impossible to wiggle out of, like an iron vice lined in velvet, and today he was winding the handle. The invitations had been issued, politely, formally, and with Wolfe's usual disdain for human unpredictability. Clara Vole, Russell Darnell, Fletcher the scarfed stooge, and even Fritz, though in his case it was more of a courtesy than a summons. They were all expected at 4 o'clock sharp for what Wolfe called, with restrained menace, a clarification of timelines. What he meant was a trap. I spent the morning tightening the screws behind the scenes. Saul Panzer had come through, as always. Not only had Fletcher lurked outside the brownstone during Clara's visit, but he'd been spotted later that same afternoon entering a FedEx store on 40th Street. He'd sent a padded envelope to Russell Darnell's apartment. Same-day delivery, marked private. We didn't know what was inside, but it didn't take a mind like Wolfe's to guess it had something to do with custard and theft. Wolfe had also requested I dig through the delivery logs. Not for Darnell or Fletcher, but for something closer to home. Something off. That's when I found it. A signed delivery on Wednesday morning, addressed to Fritz Brenner. A package of candied blood orange peel, identical to the one Fritz kept in the cellar, now missing. Only this one hadn't come from any supplier Fritz usually used. It had been shipped express from a boutique importer in Chicago. The sender, Fletcher Baines. That bit, when I told Wolfe, made him emit a noise not unlike a man spotting mold on a prized camembert. At once clever and clumsy, he said, a fool's blend. So now we had a stolen recipe, a lifted ingredient, and a flimsy attempt at planting the evidence back. Either Fletcher thought Fritz wouldn't notice the swap, or he assumed Fritz wouldn't tell Wolfe if he did. He assumed wrong on both counts. By the time the guests arrived, the office had been prepared like a stage. Wolfe sat in his chair, freshly polished globe nearby. Fritz had set out a tray of cinnamon cookies, noticeably lacking any citrus. I took my place by the bookshelves, pad in hand, trying to look as neutral as possible for someone ready to record. A slow surgical dismantling. Clara was first to arrive, punctual and tight-lipped. She wore a simple black dress and the kind of focus you usually see on air traffic controllers. Then came Russell Darnell, cravat crisp, ego barely fitting through the door. Fletcher slinked in behind him, collar high, eyes low, like someone hoping. If he walked quietly enough, he might turn invisible. Fritz entered last, nodding once to Wolfe, then folding his arms behind his back, like a man prepared to defend his kitchen to the death. Wolfe didn't speak for a moment. He let the room settle into silence like a soufflé before serving. Then he said, "Miss Vole, you allege that a recipe, your recipe, was taken while you were visiting this house. Do you still assert that claim?" "Yes," she said, steady. "I know it was in my satchel, and I know where it ended up." "Mr. Darnell," Wolfe said without inflection, "you asserted to me that the recipe in question was your creation. Do you maintain that position?" "Absolutely," Darnell said. "Flavor is collaborative. She may think she invented it, but inspiration is slippery." "Indeed," Wolfe said, "but not ingredients." He turned his gaze to Fletcher. "You were outside this house at 3:42 p.m. on the afternoon in question. What were you doing?" Fletcher looked around like he might find a fire escape behind the ficus. I was just dropping something off," he said. "You entered the vestibule, possibly the hall." "No, I never—" "You were alone in the vestibule while Miss Vole's bag sat in the adjoining kitchen. It contained a recipe, one which was never shown to you or your employer. Darnell made a sharp movement. You're saying he stole it? I never asked him to do that. I did not say that, Wolfe said mildly. Yet, he reached to his side table and lifted a small tin, a twin to the one Fritz had kept in the cellar. He opened it, allowing the scent of candied citrus to fill the room. This, he said, was delivered yesterday morning, addressed to Mr. Brenner, as if it belonged here, as if to cover the disappearance of its twin. Fritz stiffened. I did not order that. Nor, would you, Wolfe said, because it came from Chicago, from Mr. Fletcher Baines. All eyes turned. Fletcher's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Mr. Baines, Wolfe continued, either you lifted the original and sought to cover your tracks, or someone else did, and you foolishly took the fall. Which is it? Fletcher looked at Darnell, who sat very still. I didn't mean it wasn't like that, Fletcher said. I thought if it was just an ingredient— Wolfe cut him off. No one steals ingredients. One borrows sugar. One does not post. Citrus under a false name. You were directed. Darnell stood up, face tight. You're twisting this. None of this proves anything. No, Wolfe said calmly. Not yet. But the truth often precedes proof, like aroma precedes taste. Clara spoke next, her voice low. Did you send him? Darnell didn't answer. She stood, took a step closer to Wolfe's desk. I poured years into that recipe. I refined every spice, every ratio. It wasn't collaboration. You gave up on nuance, I didn't, Darnell sneered. You always thought you were better, that your palate was gospel. Well, now everyone thinks that dessert is mine. That's what matters. No, Wolfe said, folding his hands. What matters is that you believe theft could elevate your work. It cannot. Darnell started to speak again, but Wolfe silenced him with a gesture. Then he turned to me. Archie, call Inspector Kramer. Inform him we have a theft, culinary and postal, federal in part. He may wish to detain Mr. Baines for questioning. Fletcher paled. Wait, I didn't mean— I suggest silence, Wolfe said. It is the only recipe for dignity you have left. Darnell stormed out. Fletcher followed, defeated. Clara stayed behind. Wolfe regarded her. You have your answer, he said. But I advise caution. Revenge can be just as intoxicating as nutmeg, and twice as bitter. She nodded slowly. Thank you, Mr. Wolfe. As she left, Wolfe exhaled. Fritz, he said, dinner, something without citrus. The brownstone was quiet again, but not still. Wolfe hadn't moved from his chair, yet the room felt taut like a chessboard mid-match, players seated, but every piece poised for war. The confrontation hadn't ended the matter. It had only stripped away the easy lies. The hard ones, the ones buried under pride and ambition, still needed to be dug out. After Darnell and Fletcher left, Clara lingered in the vestibule, her expression taut but unreadable. I walked her to the door. Thanks, she said as I helped her with her coat. Not for taking my side, just for not taking his. I like custard, I told her, but I like honesty more. She smiled at that faintly and disappeared, into the late afternoon chill. Back in the office, Wolfe was regarding the remains of the confrontation like a man inspecting the debris after a kitchen fire. His hands were steepled, his eyes low, his body unmoving. Classic Wolfe posture, which meant the wheels in his head were grinding at high speed. I poured myself a splash of sherry and waited. He finally broke the silence. Russell Darnell is not finished. I raised an eyebrow. You think he'll double down after all that? Wolfe grunted. He is a man unaccustomed to failure, especially in public. His ego is not dented. It dares cracked, and cracks widen under pressure, he paused. Fletcher is a symptom, Darnell is the disease. Poetic, I said. But what's the prognosis? Wolfe closed his eyes. We let him stew, for now. He didn't say it, but I understood. Darnell hadn't just stolen a recipe. He'd invaded Wolfe's house, insulted its sanctity, and tried to sneak out through the servant's entrance of plausible deniability. Wolfe doesn't like people slipping through doors he didn't open. Himself. We were in the positioning phase now, the part Wolfe excels at. He wouldn't act with force or public drama. He'd exert pressure the way he always does, privately, surgically, and with devastating accuracy. Over the next 2 days, things moved quietly. Saul Panzer followed Darnell, not physically this time, but through paper. He confirmed that the tartlet recipe had been submitted to 3 food magazines under Darnell's name, 2 with minor changes, 1 verbatim. Wolfe noted each instance with a mutter and a disapproving shake of the head, like a sommelier sniffing a cork that had lied about its age. Fritz, meanwhile, reported another detail. A visitor from the Food Network had come by Darnell's shop, a producer, scouting for a new holiday special. They'd raved about the revolutionary twist on a classic custard, a televised theft, Wolfe muttered. At last, the full insult. It was clear now what Darnell wanted, not just recognition but public adoration. Clara's recipe wasn't just a crime of taste, it was a career move. So Wolfe escalated, not loudly, not with threats, but with a single phone call. He rang up Francine Ross, the food writer who'd tasted Darnell's tartlet early. They'd crossed paths before, Wolfe and Ross. She respected his palate, and she respected his standards even if she occasionally mocked his flair for drama in print. He invited her for tea. She arrived 2 days later, sharp-eyed and chic in navy. Fritz had prepared scones, clotted cream, and a small tart Wolfe referred to as his own experiment. When Francine bit into it, her brow furrowed. She chewed thoughtfully. "This is familiar," she said, "but not quite the same as Darnell's." "It should be," Wolfe said. "It was made from the original recipe by its rightful creator." He let the statement hang in the air, unsweetened. Francine blinked. "You're telling me Darnell's tartlet wasn't his?" "I am. And you can prove that?" Wolfe inclined his head slightly. "I can demonstrate opportunity, motive, and method. I can also, if required, summon an affidavit from the actual creator, complete with timestamps and drafts, including the printout he acquired through dishonest channels." Francine smiled. "You want me to expose him?" "I want you to tell the truth, which is also in this case the more flavorful narrative." She sipped her tea. "Darnell will hate it." "I expect so." She leaned back. "Then you'll get your justice. But Clara, she'll get her name restored, which I suspect she values more than fame." Francine agreed to run the story, tactfully but truthfully. No lawsuits, no blood, just culinary correction on a national scale. Wolfe had played it beautifully. No courtroom, no confrontation, just pressure applied in the place Darnell cared about most, his reputation. After she left, Wolfe permitted himself a small exhale. But there was still one card to play. The next afternoon, I received a call from Lamb and Baxter. Clara wanted to speak to me. I headed over and found her in the back, surrounded by racks of fresh croissants and eclairs so perfect they looked like they'd been carved by laser. "I heard," she said, "the magazine piece." Wolfe doesn't throw punches. He drops them in your lap with a folded napkin. She smiled. "I owe him, and you." "You don't owe me anything," I said. "But if you wanted to feed me out of gratitude, I wouldn't object." That earned a laugh. Then her face changed. Thoughtful. Tight. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I didn't mention it before because I wasn't sure." I waited. After Darnell's assistant left Wolfe's house that day, I found something in my satchel. A paper, not mine. I thought it was just a receipt and tossed it, but now I think maybe it was a note. A message. What kind of message? She frowned. A warning, or a gloat? I'm not sure, but it said in handwriting I didn't recognize, "Everything sweet begins with a theft." That was enough to send a chill up my spine. Do you still have it? She shook her head. I'm sorry. I didn't think it mattered. I relayed the message to Wolfe when I got back. He closed his eyes. Fletcher, he said. He thought he was being clever. A calling card, like a magician leaving behind a puff of smoke. He opened his eyes. We're done, Archie. You're sure? Yes. Clara is vindicated. Darnell is discredited. And our kitchen is no longer contaminated by stolen citrus. He stood not fully, just enough to reach for a volume on his bookshelf. I require no applause, he said. Just peace. And dinner? He considered. Braised lamb. And a proper tartlet, one conceived, not copied. At 4 o'clock sharp the next day, the players returned to the brownstone. You might think they'd have known better. After all, anyone who's been summoned to Wolfe's office once and made it out with their dignity intact should think twice before climbing those steps again. But dignity is a fragile thing, especially when pride's been poked, and Wolfe knew precisely how to jab without ever raising his voice. The rain outside hadn't let up all day. A cold, whispering drizzle had turned the sidewalks slick and the air into a heavy soup of wet leaves and exhaust. It made everything feel slower, thicker, like time itself was reluctant to move forward. Inside the brownstone, though, things were about to heat up. Darnell arrived first, punctual out of pride. He wore a charcoal suit and a bitter expression, as if someone had swapped his favorite spice rack with baking soda. Fletcher trailed behind him, looking like he was walking into a dentist's office with a guilty conscience and a chipped tooth. Clara Vole entered a few minutes later, shoulders square, expression calm. I opened the door for her and gave a short nod. She gave one back, almost imperceptible. Fritz came in last, not as a guest, but a sentinel. He stood just inside the door, arms crossed, a quiet presence. Wolfe didn't ask him to be there. He didn't have to. The atmosphere in the office was tense enough to frost a mirror. Everyone found their seat. Darnell, perhaps out of habit, took the red chair again. Clara settled on the edge of the green one, legs crossed, spine stiff. Fletcher didn't sit until Darnell did, and then tried to shrink into the upholstery. Wolfe sat unmoving in his throne behind the desk, his hands steepled over his midsection like a cathedral roof. I have, Wolfe began, invited you all here to complete a process which began regrettably with deceit. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You are all aware of the accusation that a recipe, Miss Vole's intellectual property, was taken from this house without consent and passed off as another's work. I have taken it upon myself to determine if that claim is valid. Darnell scoffed. You've already made up your mind, haven't you? No, Wolfe said, but your conduct has made the evidence less difficult to arrange. Darnell opened his mouth, but Wolfe cut him off with a small flick of his index finger. I do not permit interruptions when the truth is preparing to speak. That shut him up. Wolfe continued, turning slightly toward Clara. Miss Vole, you allege that your recipe, stored in your satchel, was taken during your visit here. You assert that no one else had access to it before or after. That is still your claim? Clara nodded. Yes. Wolfe turned to Darnell. And you maintain that your version is coincidentally similar, developed independently without theft? Darnell gave a tight nod. Correct. And yet, Wolfe said, we have a time-stamped photograph placing your assistant, Mr. Baines, outside my vestibule at the critical moment. A shipping receipt linking him to the delivery of candied blood orange peel to my cook without authorization or explanation, and a published recipe attributed to you that mirrors Miss Vole's draft in language and flavor profile down to the gram. Wolfe paused. That is a trinity of coincidence, Mr. Darnell, so unlikely that only arrogance would expect belief. Fletcher shifted in his seat. Darnell stared straight ahead, jaw tight. Wolfe let the silence sit a moment longer before continuing. "Mr. Baines," he said, turning slightly, "did you remove the recipe?" Fletcher glanced at Darnell, who said nothing. I only looked," he stammered. "It was open. I thought maybe I'd get ideas, notes, a draft. I didn't think—" "Did Mr. Darnell instruct you?" Fletcher looked like a cornered mouse. He told me to watch for anything interesting. He didn't say steal. But when I saw it, I knew he'd want it." "And the candied peel?" Wolfe asked. Fletcher swallowed. "He needed it, for the test batch. I didn't mean to leave the tin. I just panicked after I took the original." "Panicked," Wolfe repeated, "and then covered your tracks with a shipping label." He turned back to Darnell. "Your fingerprints are all over this, Mr. Darnell. Not physically, clever of you, but in motive and opportunity. You used this house's hospitality to take what you could not create. And you used your assistant to do what your name could not survive." Darnell stood. "Enough of this sanctimonious theatre." Wolfe didn't flinch. "No, it has only just begun." He opened a folder on his desk and withdrew a single page. "Miss Ross's article will publish tomorrow. She has agreed to clarify the authorship of the recipe, supported by Miss Vole's signed documentation and corroborated by internal drafts from Lamb and Baxter. 3 editors have been notified of the deception, including the one who accepted your submission." He set the paper down. "You will not suffer criminal charges. Miss Vole has no interest in prolonging the farce, but your name will no longer be attached to her work, and your public narrative, I suspect, will curdle." Darnell said nothing. His lips were thin, eyes glassy. He turned without a word and walked out, Fletcher scrambling after him like a kicked dog looking for permission to limp. When the door clicked shut, Wolfe sighed, not dramatically, just enough to deflate the room. Clara stood. "Thank you," she said. Wolfe didn't look up. "Thank justice, I only arranged the table." She smiled at that, a soft one this time, genuine, then let me clear the dishes. She turned and left. When we were alone, I exhaled. Hell of a gathering. "Yes," Wolfe said, reaching for the bell to summon Fritz. "But necessary. The truth is like custard, Archie, fragile and best served without interruption." Fritz entered a moment later. Wolfe looked up at him. "Tonight, something hearty. Braised oxtail, no tartlets, we've earned salt." Fritz nodded and disappeared. I sat on the edge of the desk and cracked my knuckles. "You really think Darnell's done?" Wolfe sniffed. "He is not a man who recovers well from public exposure. He will vanish into reinvention. And Clara, she will bake, and she will be watched." "By us?" "By them," Wolfe said, gesturing vaguely toward the world. "The culinary vultures. They smell originality like blood." I nodded. "Speaking of which, how'd your own tartlet compare?" Wolfe allowed himself a modest smirk. "It was acceptable," which, coming from him, was praise enough for a revolution. The day after the gathering, things around the brownstone fell back into something like peace, at least for anyone who hadn't witnessed the verbal deconstruction Wolfe had so neatly performed on Russell Darnell. But peace is relative when you live with a man who believes quiet is a moral imperative, and intellectual resolution is the highest form of domestic hygiene. For Wolfe, the matter was nearly finished. The culprits had confessed, the truth was poised to appear in national print, and Clara Vole's name had been cleared without a courtroom, a headline scandal, or any actual violence, unless you count the psychological bruising Darnell had suffered. Has Wolfe verbally diced his ego into chiffonade? But for me there was still something bothering the back of my mind, a puzzle piece not missing exactly, but askew. It was the note Clara had mentioned. Everything sweet begins with a theft. Something about it didn't sit right. When I brought it up to Wolfe during our usual mid-morning coffee, he gave a grunt. Yes, he said, it is the one element that lacks utility, a flourish, unnecessary unless it served a function. Like what? I asked. He took a thoughtful sip. A message, perhaps. But to whom? I answered my own question. Not to Clara. She'd already been stolen from. Not to you, you hadn't intervened yet. Then to Darnell, Wolfe mused. A sign the deed was done, or a taunt? But why leave it in her bag? I said. Why not just tell him? Wolfe set his cup down. Unless the note wasn't. For Darnell, or for Miss Vole, but for us. Now that was interesting. I leaned back. You think Fletcher wanted to get caught? Wolfe looked toward the window, where late autumn light filtered through the slats in long lemon-colored bars. No, he said. I think Fletcher believed he was playing both sides, that he was smarter than Darnell, and that the note was insurance, proof he was acting with subtlety, not stupidity. Still doesn't explain why leave it where she'd find it. Because she didn't find it, Wolfe said. She threw it away. That was the key. Clara hadn't read the note until after the confrontation, after she'd mentally reviewed her day and remembered something odd. Fletcher had counted on that. He wanted someone to find the note, but not too soon. A legacy of cleverness, Wolfe said, left behind like a calling card or a fuse. The doorbell rang before we could dig further. I answered it and found Saul Panzer standing there, with the expression he usually reserves for important moments, grave, composed, but with the barest glint of satisfaction. I have something, he said, stepping inside. Wolfe straightened slightly in his chair. Proceed. Saul took a small envelope from his inside coat pocket. From Darnell's assistant, or rather, no longer his assistant. He handed Wolfe the envelope. Inside was a folded page, plain, typed, unsigned. Wolfe scanned it. After a long pause, he handed it to me. The letter read, "You were right. He told me to watch, to retrieve anything that could give him an edge. He didn't call it theft, but he didn't stop me either. He encouraged me to use my discretion so long as it made the final product sing. He wanted the tartlet done in time for the showcase. I took the recipe, I took the peel, I left the note. I thought it was clever, it wasn't, it was vanity, just like his. He used me, then threw me aside when you showed up. I'm not innocent, but I'm not the only one who isn't." That was all Wolfe exhaled, slow and deep like a diver surfacing after holding his breath through a long descent. "It is as we suspected," he said. "Fletcher's turned on him," I said. "A final act of self-preservation." "Or repentance," Wolfe said, not quite convinced. "What now?" "Now," Wolfe said, "we let gravity do the work. The article publishes this afternoon. The magazine will issue a correction in its print edition next week. Fletcher's letter, if forwarded discreetly, will seal Darnell's fate in professional circles. He will be done." He paused. "And more importantly, the violation of this house is now formally atoned for." I whistled. "You really take these things personally?" "I do," Wolfe said, "because the brownstone is not a place for theft, or for foolishness masquerading as ambition." Just then, the phone rang. I answered. "Mr. Goodwin?" A voice asked. "This is Francine Ross." "Miss Ross," I said, right on cue. "I wanted to let Mr. Wolfe know the article's live. The response is already flooding in, mostly supportive, a few Darnell loyalists crying foul, but the evidence speaks louder." "Of course it does," I said. "It's been marinating in logic all week." She laughed. "Tell Wolfe I owe him a tart, or a book deal." I relayed the message. Wolfe offered a non-committal grunt of approval, which I passed along verbatim. When I hung up, the silence returned, deep and satisfying. Wolfe didn't need to say it, but I knew what came next. The matter was closed. Not just resolved but contained, classified and filed away in whatever drawer Wolfe kept for crimes that didn't end in handcuffs, but in reputational collapse. I gave him a sideways, "Look, you know," I said, "for a guy who never leaves the house, you do a fine job of wrecking people's careers from your chair." "I don't wreck," he said calmly. "I reveal." Potato, potato. Wolfe ignored that. Fritz entered the office with impeccable timing. "Dinner in 30, gentlemen," he said. "Braised oxtail and herbed lentils, and a new tartlet." Wolfe raised an eyebrow. Fritz smiled. "Pear and star anise, mine. No citrus, no theft." Wolfe gave a single approving nod. "Excellent." As Fritz exited, Wolfe leaned back with the air of a man who had regained not just justice but his appetite. "Archie," he said, "yeah, let that be a reminder." "Of what?" He picked up his glass of beer and examined it thoughtfully. "That ambition without integrity," he said, "is like custard without heat. It never sets." Dinner was quiet, which in the Wolfe household means something close to sacred. Fritz had outdone himself. The braised oxtail came apart with the ease of an honest confession, swimming in a sauce that would have made a grown man renounce false spices. The herbed lentils were balanced enough to make you question your loyalty to potatoes. And the tartlet, pear, and star anise, was so subtly layered that Wolfe let out something dangerously close to a sigh of contentment. We didn't talk much. Wolfe believes conversation at dinner dilutes flavor. I believe silence gives indigestion. But on nights like this, even I play along. After the final plate was cleared and Fritz had retreated to his sanctum, Wolfe remained at the table longer than usual. He sipped his beer slowly, the glass fogged with condensation, and stared toward the far wall like there was something there only he could see. I sat back watching him. The storm was over, the suspect exposed. The brownstone returned to its natural equilibrium. And yet Wolfe hadn't fully settled. I could see it in the way his eyes hovered just off focus, as though reviewing something he hadn't yet decided to put away. "You're still chewing on something," I said. He glanced at me, barely moving his head. "Do you find it surprising, Archie," he said, "that a man would risk his reputation for the sake of flavor?" "Surprising? No. You've nearly bitten my head off for under-seasoning pork." He didn't crack a smile, but one eyebrow rose with what I'd learned to interpret as private amusement. "Darnell wasn't chasing flavor," he said. "He was chasing ownership, prestige. He didn't want to create something beautiful. He wanted to be seen as the man who had. He was a thief with a sweet tooth. He was worse," Wolfe said. "He was an imitator, a parasite with a press agent." There was heat in that, rare from Wolfe. He usually saves his contempt for inefficiency, poor grammar, or overpriced wine lists. But this had cut deeper. It hadn't just violated justice. It had insulted the sanctity of creation. Wolfe may have hated exercise, noise, and most social functions, but he respected the sacred act of making something original. Whether it was a dish, a deduction, or an orchid hybrid, theft by imitation was blasphemy in his house. I poured myself a splash of brandy. "You know, it's strange. Darnell had the talent. He didn't need to steal." "Talent is not character," Wolfe said. "One is a gift, the other is discipline." That sounded like a line he'd been saving for years. "I wonder what happens to him now," I said. "He will vanish," Wolfe replied. "He may try to rebrand, to reinvent himself. Some second-tier festival, a streaming show with decorative confections. But among those who matter, chefs, critics, craftsmen, he is finished. The Ross article was the knife. Fletcher's letter twisted it. And Clara," Wolfe allowed himself a small nod, "she will be fine. Perhaps better than fine. This will raise her profile. If she keeps her head and her recipes to herself, she may even outlast the scandal. Are you going to keep working with her? I do not involve myself in reputational rehabilitation, but I will accept eclairs, if offered. That was the closest Wolfe came to a compliment. There was a knock on the front door. I looked at Wolfe. He grunted. I stood and went to answer it. It was Clara. She stood under the porch light, umbrella folded at her side, damp hair curling slightly at the edges. She looked tired but calm, like someone who'd finally exhaled after holding their breath through a storm. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said. "You've already been robbed once," I said. "Might as well make use of the scene of the crime." She smiled faintly. I stepped aside to let her in. She followed me to the office where Wolfe had already returned to his chair. He didn't rise. "Miss Vole," he said, "your presence is unexpected." "I just wanted to thank you," she said, properly, "and also in return something." She reached into her coat and pulled out a slip of paper, the original note. "Everything sweet begins with a theft." I lied. She said, "I didn't throw it out. I kept it. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I'd need it." Wolfe regarded it. "I no longer do," she said, "but I thought you might." Wolfe took it without comment, placed it on the desk. "And what will you do now?" he asked. She straightened her coat. "Bake, sleep, bake again. I've had 3 offers in the last 24 hours. Not just jobs, partnerships. Turns out surviving scandal is good for business." Wolfe gave a tight nod. "May I offer advice?" he asked. She blinked. "Of course. Guard your work, not with locks, but with clarity. Know who you are, what you will and will not compromise. You cannot prevent thieves, but you can make their thefts obvious." She took that in slowly. "Thank you," she said again. Wolfe inclined his head. "Fritz is preparing a pear tartlet. Would you like one?" "I would," she said, smiling, "but I should go." She turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. That note, it wasn't just about theft. It was about what theft takes. I thought it meant flavor. Now I think it meant credit, confidence, peace." Wolfe didn't answer. He just watched her go. When the door clicked shut behind her, I picked up the note. "You keeping this?" "No," Wolfe said. "Burn it." I held it between 2 fingers. The paper was smooth, the ink smudged slightly from moisture or guilt. "You sure?" "Yes," he said. "Some things should not be archived." I tossed it in the fireplace, watched the flames curl around the edges, then swallow it whole. Wolfe stood, a rare thing, and walked slowly to the window. Outside, the drizzle had stopped, the sky was clearing. The city, in its strange way, was beginning to forgive. After a long silence, Wolfe spoke. "Archie." "Yeah?" He turned slightly. "There is a rare satisfaction in watching deception collapse under its own weight. I prefer watching people eat crow with custard." He almost smiled. Then he returned to his chair, reached for his book, and opened it with deliberate care. The brownstone was still again. Dinner had been served, justice had been plated. And somewhere, beneath it all, the faint scent of pear and star anise still lingered. The next morning, the city did what it always does after scandal breaks. It moved on like nothing had happened. Cabs honked, pigeons strutted, customers at yo. Lamb and Baxter stood in line like prophets awaiting their pastry. But the taste in the professional culinary world was different, bitter, like someone had burned the custard and tried to blame the bowl. Francine Ross's article had detonated just after midnight. It was crisp, careful, and laced with a kind of surgical vindication that only a food critic with a knife-sharp vocabulary could deliver. She laid out the facts without flourish, the original recipe's timeline, the flavor notes that were too specific to be coincidence, the assistant's letter, Darnell's silence, damning in itself, and Clara Vole's clear, restrained statement, an honest account with no seasoning of vengeance. By the time Wolfe came down to the office that morning, the fallout had already begun. Darnell's restaurant had gone dark. 3 major culinary festivals had scrubbed his name from their spring rosters. His publisher issued a review of his next cookbook deal. It was the kind of reputational collapse you couldn't bake your way out of. Not even with meringue. Wolfe settled into his chair without ceremony. The orchids had been tended, the breakfast cleared, and all that remained was the final act of reflection. The part of the play where the audience leans forward to hear what the detective really thinks, not about the crime, but about the people who commit them. "You know," I said, taking my place across from him, "I keep turning it over. Darnell could have built something better. He had the talent." "He lacked the patience," Wolfe said, folding his hands over his middle, "and the humility. I still don't get why he had Fletcher plant that tin in our cellar. What was the angle?" Wolfe sniffed. "To sow confusion. Or to implicate someone else, Fritz, perhaps. An attempt to obscure the timeline. But Fritz doesn't exactly fit the profile of a citrus-smuggling saboteur." Wolfe arched an eyebrow. "Desperation rarely considers plausibility. It simply grabs at distance." He closed his eyes a moment. "Mr. Darnell believed that control over appearance would suffice, but appearances are brittle. A single fracture, and the whole structure crumbles." I nodded. "Like custard without the proper heat." Wolfe opened one eye. "Don't be clever." "I'm never clever," I said, "only accurate." He allowed it. The doorbell rang. Fritz answered, and a moment later showed Clara in again. She looked more relaxed than I'd ever seen her. The battle was over, the air cleared, and she wore something that looked suspiciously like peace. She handed Wolfe a small white box. "No ribbon, no note." "I said I'd send one," she said. Wolfe opened the lid. Inside was a tartlet. Pear and star anise, no garnish, perfect symmetry. "I understand you made this with Fritz," she added. "He offered his kitchen," Wolfe replied. "You offered your palate. I merely supervised." "You called it acceptable," she said. Wolfe gave her a rare glance of full regard. "I revise that. It is definitive." She smiled, genuine this time. She didn't linger. No speech, no tears. Just a nod, and then she was gone. When the door closed behind her, I looked at Wolfe. "You know, she could have come in here swinging, demanding revenge, public apology, the whole circus." "She has no need," Wolfe said. "Her name is restored, her work is intact, and she has learned the price of trust in a field crowded with envy." "Still," I said, "you didn't have to help her." "No," he said, "but someone tampered with my house. They left with what was not theirs. That alone justified intervention." He paused, then added, "The rest was merely seasoning." We sat in silence a while longer. Outside, a delivery truck backed up with the usual chaos. A dog barked on the sidewalk. The world resumed its endless boil. Inside, the brownstone returned to stillness. Dinner would be served at 7. Wolfe would remain in his chair. I would pour the beer. And somewhere across the city, the taste of truth, bitter to some, sweet to others, lingered. It had been baked at low heat and served, as always, at the right moment.